Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the webinar on the NAEd Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. Angie, I'm not able to see your slides currently. Great, there we go. So you should now see a slideshow. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And this is our webinar on the NAEd Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. And my name is Maria Gann. I'm the Director of Professional Development Programs at the National Academy of Education. I'm joined by my colleague at the NAEd, Angie Harmon, as well as Dr. Bill Penwell, who is the chair of the Postdoc Selection Committee, as well as Distinguished Professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today, just as a brief overview of what we'll be talking about, I'll provide some technical remarks, talk a little bit about the fellowship itself, although we hope that you all have some information about the fellowship already, and if you are unclear about certain terms of the fellowship, we are happy to answer those questions, but we won't be going into much depth on that today. Our main focus today is talking about how to write a successful application and providing some information about what the online application looks like. We're also going to make sure that Dr. Penwell has plenty of time to provide his perspective on what the selection committee looks for and some tips for how to write a strong application. And then a lot of today we'll dedicate to Q&A and discussion with you all. So just a couple technical remarks. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Zoom at this point, but if you have any questions during the webinar, you can go ahead and enter those as we're speaking. You should see a Q&A box on the Zoom menu, and that's where you can type in the question that you have. This is also where you would enter any kind of tech question you might have. If, for instance, you aren't able, at any point you can't hear us or see the screen, please enter that into the Q&A. And just a note, we are recording this webinar so that we can share it on our website next week for people who are unable to attend live. So just some brief information about the fellowship itself. The National Academy of Education, where Angie and I are based, administers the program on behalf of the Spencer Foundation. And the fellowship is intended to buy out your time for the equivalent of one academic year so that you can work on a research project. Your fellowship will amount to a total of $70,000 in a stipend, which is either given to you directly as an individual or to your institution. So you have the option of how it's administered. And we have no preference. This is really up to you and your university. I would say most postdoc fellows do choose the institutional administration option simply because that's what works best for them and their department. But beyond the fellowship funding, we often hear from our fellows that the most valuable part of the experience are the professional retreats that we host for our fellows every year. So as a postdoc fellow, you attend 3 of them. So if you were to receive the fellowship this year, it would be the fall of 23, the spring of 24, and the fall of 24. And during the retreats, you receive mentoring from NAEd members and other fellowship alumni that we are always engaged and very excited to give back to the program after they've gone through it themselves. And you also present your research, which is a great opportunity for you to practice doing that in a collegial environment. And it's, I think, maybe most importantly, gives you the chance to form relationships with your cohort. And as we've seen over the years, these are professional relationships that continue throughout your career. So now I will hand it off to Angie, who's talking more about the application.
All right, so I'll discuss the application components. So it has 5 components. There's the online application form, project abstract, project description, career statement, and reference letters. The last 3 components are the ones that take the most time, so we'll describe them in the most detail. For the project description, this is where you're going to describe your research project, including the goals of the project, its contribution to the field, the significance of the work, especially as it relates to education. The project description, which we also sometimes call the project narrative, can be no more than 10 pages double-spaced. This is really not a lot of space for all that you need to explain. So the description is likely going to be the part of the application where you spend most of your time and effort. The reviewers who are going to be reading your application come from a variety of disciplines, often including your own. So it's important to write the description so that a broad but well-informed audience can understand the content and appreciate its importance to the project's impact to education. Then we have the career statement. This is where you will explain what led you to your current role, as well as your interest in this particular project. And then we'll have the letters of reference. Postdoctoral applicants must submit 3 letters of recommendation. There are no requirements for who these should be. But we always recommend that you choose people who know you and your work well. And that's, I would say, the most important aspect of the letters. Often people will go for somebody who has a big name, and yeah, that can be valuable, but it's more important that the person who is writing for you really knows your work. All right, so this is a screenshot of the fellowship application portal. The easiest way to get here is to visit our website and follow the links from the Postdoctoral Fellowship page. Depending on what browser you're using, it might look a little bit different, but it should look pretty similar to this. So keep in mind our eligibility requirements for the award. You must have had your doctoral degree conferred between January 1st, 2017 and December 31st, 2021. This does mean that there is a gap of 1 year in eligibility. So applicants who graduated in 2021 will have to wait until next year to apply, and there are not any exceptions to this policy. Having your degree conferred means having the degree issued by the university and that you have it in hand. We don't have any residency restrictions for this award. You do not have to live in the United States, work at a U.S. institution, or have your degree or have earned your degree in the United States. Nor are you required to have a formal institutional affiliation. We have had successful unaffiliated applicants in the past. Independent researchers may apply for the postdoctoral fellowship. I want to note that U.S. citizenship is not required. Your project must be related to education, which we define very broadly. This is formal and informal, K through 12 and adult professional education in or outside the U.S. and more. Note that we do not consider group applications. An IRB is required of fellowship recipients, but you don't have to submit that documentation with your application. If no IRB approval is needed, you'll simply submit a statement that says that you do not need IRB approval for your project. Finally, we don't permit concurrent funding. If you are awarded funding from for this project and then from another source such as the Ford Foundation or IES, you need to select only one source of funding for your project. I'm going to go over the selection process timeline, just a broad overview of the process. This is going to include important notifications that you may receive. Once the application portal is closed on November 16, 2022, the NAEd staff will review applications for completeness and general appropriateness. Your application will then be assigned to 2 members of our selection committee. While we do our best to match applications with appropriate selection committee members, you should plan to write, as I said, for a well-informed general audience. These reviewers will present their overview to the committee at a meeting held in February 2023. In March 2023, you'll be notified whether you are moving on to the semifinalist stage. Between the first and second selection committee meetings, semifinalist applications are sent for review to 2 external reviewers, and these are people who will be even closer to your field methodology or topic. Our second selection committee meeting will be held in April 2023, and at this time, our 25 finalists will be selected, and you'll be notified regarding your status in May 2023. Should you be selected, the fellowship period begins in July 2023, although most postdoctoral fellows choose to begin in September. So the online application, be sure that you're applying for the correct program. The name of the application should be the Postdoctoral Fellowship. You may know that we also have a Dissertation Fellowship. The two landing pages for the fellowships look very similar, so make sure you've selected the right one. If you are a previous applicant, you need to make sure you start a new application and not try to submit a previous one, as these will not be assessed. You do need to provide a summary of your previous applications, and you can contact the NAEd staff if you need access to materials from a previous application. Please note, the application due date is November 16th, 2022 at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time. This submission, including your references, must be complete by 5 p.m. This is a hard date and time. We do not accept any submissions after this time, and we do not make any edits or additions to your application after the deadline. And please note, like I said, your recommendation writers have the same deadline you do. I know for a lot of other applications you may have submitted, including your applications, for graduate school, often your recommenders can submit their letters after the deadline. So please keep in mind that this is a slightly different process. A few more notes on the application portal. Please complete all form fields and upload all required documents in a PDF format, and make sure that the form is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application review. And like I said, it's very important, and we highly suggest that you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing an application, and bring them into the process. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as the selection committee does pay close attention to these letters. Remember, they have the same deadline that you do. The application portal will send automatic emails when you input the names of your letter writers, and your references will receive instructions and a link to upload their letters. Please contact me if you have any issues with getting these letters out to your references. As I mentioned previously, we will provide written updates through email, so it's really important that all of the email addresses you input are correct. And to close out the application, the overview of the application, two final notes. All application components, including those letters, are due November 16th, 2022 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we do suggest you submit your application well in advance of the deadline. The application portal receives a lot of traffic, and we receive typically a high volume of emails and phone calls on that date. So if you want to make sure that everything is in order, it's good to try to make sure that your submission is submitted a few days early. And with the application overview completed, I will turn the presentation over to Bill Penwell, who's going to talk a little bit more about the written narrative and your audience. Bill?
Thanks, Angie. As I said, I'm the incoming chair of the selection committee, and I've been reviewing for a couple of years, so I have some experience in reviewing this and can tell you a little bit first about who your audience is for this. And the first thing to know is that it's a group of academics who are doing research and education on education, and they are both within our field, but also allied fields like sociology, anthropology, and sociology. There are multiple disciplines here represented, and so many of us in education, we also are working with other disciplinary backgrounds. I'm a developmental psychologist, for example, and a learning scientist. There are many others represented. There are 2 external readers for each of the proposals, and we try to make those closer to the applicant's area of work But oftentimes we are reading outside of our immediate area of expertise, and that's really important to know in preparing your narrative, because you're going to have readers who won't know the terms of art in your subfield necessarily. And so you'll need to bring people along in helping them to understand that. It does include both members of the National Academy of Education, like myself, and other senior scholars in the field. There are, for those of us who are reviewing, we are generally reviewing anywhere from 25 to 35, sometimes more as they come to us proposals. And that's something also to keep in mind, is that you want to think about making our jobs easy for us to be able to follow the logic of your proposal and be aware that we're reading quite a number. We are, as reviewers, both curious and questioning. This is by far and away my favorite set of reviewing to do, because of all the incredible ideas that come in that are and novel approaches and ideas and questions that people are asking. And so, and I think that's the approach that many of us take. It's like, wow, this is really incredible to get to see a lot of ideas and new directions for the field. And we're really questioning. And by that, we mean that we give a critical read to every proposal in terms of how feasible is this? Are the methods very strong? How does the proposal cohere? And you will get really good feedback from the members of the committee on your proposal to potentially improve it if you have to resubmit, but also to improve it if you actually are funded. Really, there's a broad range of expertise in across methodologies and analytic approaches that are represented on the committee too. Go to the next slide. So what does your audience really need to know? First, you need to locate yourself in a field of study. And the way I like to think about this is you are joining in a conversation. That conversation began before you got here. And you want to say, where are you entering that conversation? What have people said? What are the different positions or viewpoints on the phenomenon that you're studying? And what are you bringing to that conversation? And what you are bringing is maybe a theoretical perspective. It may also be some background in the specific area and having already been part of that conversation, hopefully as well. And you need to make that really clear in your proposal. It's extraordinarily important to know the history of relevant ideas and work. A good assumption to make is that other people have worked on this problem before. Your claims that what we're doing is completely novel are probably not true. You may be in an area where there aren't great solutions or great perspectives on the problem, but in all likelihood, there are relevant history, is a history of ideas and work that you can bring to bear. And knowing that is important because it actually helps you with this question of how you're going to actually join this conversation. It's really important for us as a committee to have a sense of how you're going to contribute to our collective understanding of education-related issues. We, as a field, have a set of questions that are important to us that help make progress towards important issues such as educational equity. And especially if we're reading something that is not in our immediate field, you're really going to have to make that case quite explicitly for us. Why is the contribution important? What is the consequence of your work? Will the results be useful to policymakers or practitioners? And I know I really appreciate it when I can really see a pathway, not just an assertion, but a pathway towards how this could influence a policy decision, or, for example, evidence that practitioners care about your problems and are really interested in a solution to it. So there's a range of things that we look at in communicating the information. It is both your narrative, but also the letters of recommendation, your larger career goals, and your personal statement important. I would add too that we also look at a writing sample that you include as part of this. The next slide. What are some other things that the audience needs to know? Really, it's about the importance of the topic. And I can't stress enough, you're going to be speaking to a multidisciplinary group. And we as a group actually discuss the proposals, even though there are two primary readers. And so you're speaking to that whole group and trying to make a compelling argument about your your proposed work in some sense. Avoid a lot of jargon, define your terms. I would say I give the advice of making only 2 or 3 big terms that are really important to your work that you get as freebies to define and think about as these are your key terms. And for the most part, though, if you can use accessible language, that's going to help make the case for the importance of your work with this multidisciplinary group better than using multiple terms of art throughout your proposal that we have to struggle to understand and really grapple with. Also, be clear about the specific questions of the research project. Frame them as questions. Put them in a couple of places. It's helpful for me as a reader to have them early on in the proposal and also again in the methods section. And really to choose the questions that push forward the field, that indicate that you know you're entering the conversation at a particular point. Methodology is really key. You want to think about devoting a significant chunk of your word count to describing your methodology. A common mistake early on in careers I see is spending a lot of time up front on your theory and not enough time on your methodology. We really want to hear, what kind of method are you using? And a broad range of methodologies are appropriate, from case studies to longitudinal quantitative analysis to historical and archival work, anthropological studies, laboratory studies. We see a wide range, and that's appropriate, but we need to know what that methodology is and that it's appropriate for the research question that you're asking. It's also great to be humble about the limitations of your approach that you're taking. What are you not going to be able to say? What kinds of causal claims, especially, would you be able to make or not make, given your research designs, given the limitations of your context, given the measures that you are using? And then finally, I think this gets a lot of play for us, given the short time frame of the fellowship itself. These are the measures practical, given the time, resources, and other considerations. With respect to analyses, it's really important to describe both the broad type of analysis you'll do and also be really specific about how your analyses will answer your study questions. A good diagnostic tool that I often tell my own students is, if I can cover up your research questions and methods and I get to your approach to analysis section, and I could tack that on to any proposal or any study, you haven't done the work of helping me understand how this analysis plan answers your research questions. So if that diagnostic is helpful and you can ask people to help you read your own proposal with that in mind, I really suggest it. So the methods and analyses are really important. And obviously, because the fellowship is for a year, it's really important to provide a clear and realistic time frame for getting that study completed. And if this is your first time kind of building such a study from scratch, really turn to your mentors and advisors to help you think about, this is something that I do regularly too. As somebody who's written a lot of proposals, I make sure I'm working with another person to help me think through my timeline and anticipate what are the kind of realistic benchmarks that I need to hit. What can I do? What's really not possible to do in the year? Thinking and considering about things like informed consent and what it might take if you're doing an original data collection, or access to sites, whether that's an archival site or a field site of some kind. So one question that arises is, should I create it, develop an appendix for readers? And remember, I said we're reading, a pretty big number of proposals. And the selection committee is not required to read these. So I would use these with real caution. The narrative should include all the critical information needed to evaluate the quality of your research design, the importance of the problem that you're addressing, and how it fits into this ongoing conversation is going to make a contribution to the field. And so use the appendix more to elaborate, expand on something that's discussed in the body, but don't really use it to incorporate necessary information to evaluate the proposal. So one thing that I mentioned here in the context of considering an appendix is, as an alternative, is your extended writing sample. I always find that as a reader really helpful to understand people's capabilities, especially because there's often not enough time and space to build out a full explanation of your methodology. But when I see somebody's writing sample, it gives me a sense of their skill in putting together a coherent research plan where their methods really are set up to answer the questions they have. So really consider that writing sample as a powerful way to show more about what it is that you know and can do.
Right. And with that, thank you, Bill.
Go ahead.
With that, we're going to move on to the Q&A period. So I see a few questions have been coming into the box. But before we do that, if you have any questions in the future that are not answered, you can contact us at the info box at info@naeducation.org, and please do visit our website.
And just to let you know that I've been responding to some questions via typing in the Q&A box. You should be able to see the ones that I've answered. So in the Q&A box, there should be 3 categories at the top. And if you click answered, you can see those that I've responded to or Angie or Bill has. And that just might be helpful if you had a similar question to somebody else. For the most part, we try to answer them speaking out loud, but for quick ones, we type them in. So we have had some questions about how the leave from teaching requirement works and whether you can have concurrent funding during the fellowship period. So it's a little complicated because you do have a couple of options for how you conduct the fellowship. Ultimately, you have to have taken leave for the equivalent of 2 semesters full-time over the period of the fellowship, but you can spread that out over 1 or 2 academic years. So most people will do either 2 semesters of full-time leave in 1 academic year, fall and spring, or 2 semesters of full-time leave over 2 years. So let's say 1 fall and the next fall, or 1 spring and the next spring. But there is a third option, which is more unusual, but can be beneficial if you're just not able to take full-time leave, which is that you take part-time leave for 4 semesters. So you're dedicating 50% of your time to the fellowship, 50% to your teaching, and you do that for 2 full academic years. That's pretty unusual, but I will say we aren't going to disadvantage you during the committee review if you are proposing to do that, because we recognize that not all scholars are able to take full-time leave, and we don't want to disadvantage people based on the requirements or restrictions of their institution. But just to let you know, we have many options here. And something to do with the concurrent funding question can get a little complicated then if you're doing the part-time option. But generally, you can't have concurrent funding during your fellowship period, and that's regardless of what project that concurrent funding is supporting. So it's concurrent funding for this project and for others. But if you're doing the part-time option, we have a little flexibility. So all that to say, these are things we work out with you if you're chosen, but in your application, it's helpful to know what your plan is generally, and then we work with you if you're selected to make sure ultimately it works for you and for your institution.
Thank you, Maria. I have a question that I think, Bill, you would be a good person to answer. And this is from somebody who's saying that recommendation letters are not typically required where they're from. And they'd like to be able to provide a little bit of guidance to their letter writers about what these letters should look like.
Yeah, I was answering a couple of those related questions in the Q&A by text, but I'd love to speak to that. there's two broad categories of things that are a consideration. One is their knowledge of you as a scholar, both what your past accomplishments are, your potential, and also the alignment with the overall aims that you have. We are asked, and this is one of the criteria, like, what's the likelihood of this person continuing in education? Do they have this commitment to continue to build in the field of educational research? And so their ability to speak to you as a scholar is really important. For me, I value equally the specifics that that person has written about the quality and strength of the study that you propose. When I can see details and about the study referenced in a letter, it convinces me that, one, you've actually given them enough time to read it. You've finished a draft of this so that they could read it, give feedback on that, and presumably they are a past teacher or mentor of yours in some way. And so the details that they can speak to about the strengths of your particular study and what it's going to be contributing to the field, that's also really valuable. So I look at both of those.
Thank you, Bill. Here's another question actually that has come up several times, and it's how the committee views book projects as opposed to as a project as opposed to ones that will produce journal articles.
I think there's no preference for books versus journal articles, because the committee is well aware in fields like history that books are the coin of the realm, if you will. They're the preferred form of expression. So definitely there's been support for book projects through the committee.
We had a couple questions about IRB approval, and that's actually something you don't need to show proof of when you apply, but we will ask you for that if you're selected, provided that your project does deal with human subjects.
There's a few questions about the writing, and rather than give a answer about what it should be, I'd love to say a little bit more about, just elaborate on the point I made. It could be really any kind of writing sample from previous research project or journal. I do think it's helpful if you consider, has this piece of writing been evaluated by others? Is it your first draft of something or second draft versus is this something that not only is polished, but has been reviewed by others, whether that's your dissertation committee or an external peer review group at a journal, or if it's a technical report, some technical reports are peer reviewed. In part, that just says, hey, this is vetted. These ideas are ones that a few people have had their eyes on. Does it need to be empirical? No. But as I said, one of the things that really helps me is I feel like there's not enough space in the methodological sections, and we end up talking a lot about methods in our deliberations. If you can show you can pick something that shows your chops and being able to, carry out an ethnography if you're an ethnographer, carry out a discourse analysis if you're a discourse analyst, carry out an experimental study, or perform multi-level models if you're modeling techniques, if that's what you're proposing. So something related to your skill set, if you can show, that would be helpful.
Thank you. We have a few questions about people who and their institutions. So you do not need to be affiliated with any particular institution at the time that you apply or hold the fellowship. You may be unaffiliated with any institution. And we have, recent successful applicants who remain untied to any institution. The way that works is that you are self-funded, and we send the stipend funds directly to you.
Someone asked if we prefer a certain stage of the research project for the fellowships. So for instance, would we prefer the data collection stage, the writing stage? I'll just briefly answer before I let Bill respond too, but I would say generally we don't have a preference. Really, ultimately what you need to make a case for in your application is that you'll spend the time to, you need this time to work on this project, regardless of where you are in the project's stage, and that you will ultimately end up with some kind of products, and that may come after the fellowship period, but that there will be something that contributes to the research as a result of this project. Bill, I don't know if you want to speak to that as well.
Yeah, and we do get applications for multiple stages of the work. And the only thing that I would add is, if you're planning for a 3-year ethnography of something, that actually doesn't fit in the time frame if you are planning for the data collection to be able to answer a set of questions. So you might be wanting to actually have this be the phase of a project that's more analytic and writing. On the other hand, if you're doing secondary data analysis of a large quantitative observational data set, oftentimes really the only obstacle there is, do you have access? That we're asking ourselves the question, do you have access to this data? How long will it take you to get access? Because the project is fairly feasible, the data are collected, and you would be basically doing the analysis and writing that particular project.
Someone's asked if the funding is meant to replace salary. Is the expectation that the university provides funding to carry out the study? So we do hope that universities will provide additional funding if your salary is more than the stipend amount, so that you're not taking a salary cut. We also hope that the university or your department could help with research costs if you are intending for the stipend to buy out your salary. This all is negotiated in the period of time between when you're selected and when you start the fellowship. And the NAEd provides you some materials for how to talk through these conversations with your university. But ultimately, it is the fellow who has to have these conversations with support from the NAEd. And we try to emphasize to universities what a value that having a fellow on their campus would be. And so the hope is that they recognize that and support you in financial ways and make it easy for you to take leave as well. But again, that's something we would help you work out if you are selected.
So there have been a few questions that I've seen regarding whether we've received applications from African scholars, different types of professions or different fields, and saying that they don't see these among the previously awarded fellows. So I'd like to address these questions generally. Diversity is really important to the NAEd and to the committees, and we look at this really carefully. So just because something isn't something we funded in the past doesn't mean that was a lot of double negatives. If you should definitely apply, even if it's not something you've seen us fund before. The committees often look very carefully at all sorts of applications, and we do encourage applicants from African countries and other countries where we don't have as many fellows. The committee often does look for increasing this diversity among our fellowship, because what the committee is really trying to do is not just award individual fellows, but they're also trying to create a cohort. And the fellows are going to meet and work together at retreats, and having diversity of background and thought and geographic location, institution, race and ethnicity, all of this is really important. So I would consider this a strength of your application if you can bring that sort of diversity to the table.
Someone has asked if there's funding available for data collection, and if not, are we allowed to pursue other funding for data collection? So you could receive other funding for data collection if that takes place before your fellowship period begins, because as I mentioned, you can't have concurrent funding for the same project or different projects. But let's say you want to start the fellowship in January of 24, which is the latest you could start it for this current application cycle. You could then conduct your data collection in the summer or the fall of next year, and receive funding from another agency or from your department or university to cover that before the fellowship funding period begins. So it is possible for you to do it that way as long as it's not overlapping. Someone's asking if we're not affiliated with a university, but rather a nonprofit, for instance, how does the leave work? So essentially here you would be taking leave from your employment at that organization, so that the funding that we're providing you is essentially covering your salary for that time. So that is something we have had people do. We have had a number of scholars, fellows at nonprofits over the last few years who have managed to work that out with their organizations. So if you were ultimately selected, we'd help you figure that out. We'd also be happy to put you in touch with our alumni who have had to deal with the same thing.
I just want to add on to that a little bit about how that has worked out in the past, especially if they are education-related nonprofits hiring PhDs in education. They generally understand or encourage you to be working on research. So in several cases, they have been institutionally administered. The NAEd has sent the stipend funds to that nonprofit, which then gives the fellow leave through their job.
So a couple of questions around what a finished product looks like, and or finish, where you need to be in the phase of the end of a project. And honestly, I'm trying to rack my brain thinking about discussions where we worried a lot about that. What we mostly worried were about completed analyses and manuscripts being able to be created. But we understand too that the publication cycles are much slower than that. And certainly they would extend beyond a year for getting the work done.
So we've had a few questions specifically asking about working full-time in their current positions. I think we have addressed this, but I want to address it very directly. So you cannot you have to take the leave, and you must be devoting, even if you're part-time, you must be devoting 50% of your effort to this NAEd Spencer project. So you could not be employed full-time, although like I said, for other nonprofits, the way it worked was that we sent the funds directly to the institution. So they took the leave from the job. If you have, it's unfortunate, but if your job won't give you leave or won't let you go part-time, it's not very compatible with our fellowship. We've had a few questions about the retreat and professional development activities. And while this is primarily about the application, I'm happy to answer that because I do the majority of the planning for these retreats. So what happens is that you are given a mentor who's going to be an NAEd member, a senior scholar. You have access to networking opportunities within your cohort, the other cohorts, and our members and the senior scholars. And we have panels and small group sessions that are devoted to topics such as working on interdisciplinary collaboration, sort of how to do that, or navigating the tenure process and academic life. I think we've had fellows who say that this is, the professional development is almost more important than the funding.
Bill, I don't think you've answered a similar question to this one here, but someone's asking if I'm applying for funding for one phase of a multi-year project, is it helpful for me to talk about the whole project in relation to the phase that the fellowship would cover, and how much space should be dedicated to the whole project?
Yes, I think is the answer to that, because probably the significance of your smaller project that you're seeking funding for through the fellowship is probably owes to its fit within a larger project. You need to say enough, though, leave enough space. I can't give a formula for this, but I'll come back to the theme of methods. So I need to provide enough space about this specific project that you're seeking funding for to convince the committee that it's worthwhile, that it's sound, well-designed study, and feasible to implement within the time period.
Bill, I have another question that I think is interesting and would be good for you to answer. Someone is asking, to what extent does the loftiness of the proposal influence reviewers' views? For instance, must an endeavor be more grandiose in nature to take it more seriously than something smaller in scale, but perhaps more realistic?
That's a great question. I think reviewers might respond a little bit differently, but I can speak to what I think the proposals really do capture our attention are ones that take up a big idea, but do so in a concrete context that is realistic and workable within the time period set. So if you can help us to understand how this study fits into a longer arc of work, whether it's your own or better yet, the field, and how it's making an advance on something big, that's really ideal. And if you can also show how your particular approach, both the theory you're bringing and the methods you're bringing to bear, help to make the progress that you're promising, I would rather see as a reviewer something that's, small in scale, that fits the size of this particular fellowship. There are many questions that you simply can't answer with this fellowship that, require larger teams of people, for example, and not just a solo investigator working with one or with students and so forth. So I think considering the scope of this, I would say big idea, but having a sharp focus in a context is important.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill, here's another interesting question for you. Have people applied before who are extending their dissertation in order to turn it into a book? I do think this happens fairly often, and it'd be interesting to hear how the reviewers consider such a project.
That's great. I would say yes, this happens a fair bit, and I think we've funded a couple like that in the last couple of years, but we've also deliberated over them a lot. And I think one of the questions that we come back to for dissertations is, what's new here? You really need to make the case for the analysis that you haven't actually done yet, that you're going to do with this data or something that's new, as opposed to, I just need the time to take these 3 chapters that for my dissertation and turn them into a book or turn them into 3 journal articles. I don't think that will fly with the committee.
There's an interesting question about methods. Someone's asking, the writing sample should signal that you can perform the appropriate methods for the project, but what if you want to learn a new method as part of the fellowship? So you're using a new method that you've not used before to conduct the research.
Make sure you have really good advisors if you want to do that. I think those kinds of proposals do tend to raise a little bit more questions. Again, it's not because we don't think people can learn that stuff, a new method, but the time period of the fellowship is such that if you are learning an entirely new method, will you have the time to learn that method, get a really good grip on it enough to perform the very analyses that you want to propose, that you're proposing to do?
So we've had a couple of questions about the budget and funds. So first I'll answer the indirect costs one. So indirect costs are administrative fees and overhead usually charged by institutions when they award grants. So this is not a grant, this is a fellowship. So we do not allow universities to essentially charge an administration fee to you in order for them to be administering the fellowship. Because the funds are intended for you to use and it's not an award to the institution. This is an award to the fellow. By the way, all of the budgeted items belong to you and not to the university. And I'll talk a little bit more about what needs to go into the budget. We actually don't require a whole lot of detail. And I know if you've done a grant application before, you're familiar with budget justifications. We don't need these. It's important for you to talk about, often what happens is simply the entire budget goes to your salary and your benefits. The other major categories are travel to research locations, materials and supplies, participant incentives, or electronics, equipment that you need to perform your research. We have broad latitude. There are very few things that are unallowable with the budgeted funds. So you can't have indirect costs, and this can't be used as a salary supplement. It can't be used to increase your salary. So you also can't, that means you can't take summer salary from this.
A couple more questions coming in. Angie, someone just wanted to, if you could clarify your point about summer salary and how that.
If you could, the person who asked this question, if you could tell me what you want to know about summer salary, I'm happy to address that. But you cannot, so we don't consider the summer months as part of the fellowship, and we consider summer salary to be a supplement to your regular 9-month salary if you are, at a university. And so you cannot, often with grants, faculty will acquire different months of salary. So they have another paid position essentially during summer working on a grant project. Our fellowship is not that type of project.
Bill, here's a question for you. Someone's asking if I'm based at a teaching institution, I don't have perhaps as long of a publication record as someone at a different kind of university, how does that impact my chances of being selected?
We actually are looking for diversity of university types, not just our ones, and we monitor that throughout the review process as we go through our discussions. And there are funded projects from non-R1 universities. So I think it's great if you're considering to apply from a teaching intensive university.
And just to clarify about the eligibility window, so you are eligible to apply starting 1 year after your PhD was conferred. So if you're receiving your PhD in 22, you are eligible to start applying in 23. And the year you apply, you need to think about the fact that your fellowship wouldn't actually start till the next year. So when you're applying in 22, for instance, your fellowship could start as early as June of 23. So basically your fellowship begins 2 years after your PhD is conferred, but you're also eligible for 5 years to apply, and you are definitely encouraged to apply more than once if you're not selected the first time. It's pretty common that people have to apply more than once in order to be successful.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that a little bit about reapplications. So as Maria said, it is very common. We have a significant portion of our fellows, postdoctoral fellows each year are reapplicants. And we have people who have applied, 2, 3, or 4 times who have been successful in obtaining the fellowship. One of the things that they do in terms of success is make sure that, because you do receive some feedback from the committee that's been anonymized after the fellowship process is complete. And it's important that you look at that, at those comments carefully when you're preparing your next application. And I don't think we have too many additional questions, but Bill, why don't you talk a little bit about how the committee views reapplications?
Thanks. I think that we actually are often excited to see reapplications. But what's really important is to see that something has changed or different, that the feedback has been taken into account. And sometimes opportunities, there are reapplications where it's not the same project at all, but it's transformed. And that's okay, because sometimes you have an opportunity that is timed in some ways. The timing no longer works for you. But I think the key thing is that, for reapplication, we want to see that there's some feedback that's been taken into account. It looks like an improved project. But I would say people are encouraging of reapplication, and we have conversations about, is this the last time this person can apply? That are considerations in some of our deliberations.
All right, and we have another question. Somebody is an independent researcher based outside the US. Let's see, and they have a university in the US that's willing to host their research if they're awarded a fellowship. So this isn't actually a concern for us. You do not have to have evidence that you will be hosted at a US institution. Like we said before, you do not have to be based in the US at all to acquire the fellowship. So that's just not a concern that you need to have while you're preparing an application about whether you need evidence from a host institution. So we don't have any more open questions, and we have 2 minutes left. Oh, let me see. Okay, this person is asking essentially whether they can do work on this project outside of the time that we're funded, specifically data collection. Yes, of course, you can work on this project anytime you would like, regardless of when you are receiving funding. All right. Any last questions? I think this is unusual that we get through all of the questions. So the transcript will be available. We're going to upload this to YouTube, and I will send it out next week.
Thank you, everybody.